actually plenty to think about. Apart from the course creation for this particular project, even in the general teaching, we need to sort of rethink, reflect, and rethink the way we use technology. Actually, which now, as I promised, that I'll just share very, very briefly once my own experience of experimenting. But before that, so you all know MOOCs, these large courses that run online. In fact, just the other day, there was a team from University of Edinburgh that visited Ambedkar, and Dennis and I were in that meeting, and we were told about this MOOC that they had been running with 100,000 students on football. Right, so obviously Edinburgh, Scotland, and generally people are obsessed about football, so that's a great way to enter into conversations. So one part of the course dealt with cultural sort of context of football, and there is, like I said, it's very important to the people there. Another part of the course looked at physical or health-related aspects of football. A third part, because in Scottish history, religious identities are also tied with football. Celtics versus Rangers, that is Protestants and Catholics, and also working class background and more elite state-backed sort of identities. You could get into those questions. Apart from the issues around market, how players are valued, how they're bought and sold in the market, and so on. So I thought that was a fantastic course. That brought together also people from various different disciplines within their campus, talking about football. And everyone loves football, so perhaps, cricket could be a entry point for us to get, or maybe kabaddi, perhaps, given our emphasis on social justice. So that's one way of doing these courses. The other is an online course that I once taught, which only had 10 students. But the difference is that there was a lot of synchronized or live content there, right? So we operated through this program called Illuminate. I haven't kept up with who owns it or what those dynamics are now, but it's Illuminate with an E. So whatever. Illuminate. And it's where, it's a fantastic software where you can see all the students, if you choose. Very often they are in their dorms in pajamas, so you may not want to see them, or in a coffee shop, wherever. So there is asynchronous sorts of courses which Moodle perhaps works there. That is, you upload your written assignments, you read as you want, whenever you want, like both of you have suggested.
That is called a virtual classroom.
Yeah.
That's the
Here,
jargon by which it's known.
It's not so much at their own time, or parts of that course were also on Moodle. So there was simultaneously you could do things at your own time, but then you could be in your own space, but still interact. So this was a pilot, actually, that the program that I was working with they were piloting this sort of thing. The idea there was that this is in the American university, and there they have a lot of anxiety right now about globalizing students' experiences and getting getting experiences into the classroom from a variety of contexts. So at that point of time, actually all the 10 students were in that town itself. So it wasn't really a global platform. But one could do this. This same thing could have been done also at a wider scale. Now, I don't want to go into Illuminate, but it's, you could do polling, instant polling. It can be like, which team is going to win the match today, and students sort of vote, India or Pakistan, and then you'll immediately see the results. You could do pop quizzes within that platform. You can use your PowerPoint that you've created as a whiteboard. You could use other things that everyone has access to in the display, and so on. There could be breakout groups. You could divide students into different groups, and they can work, collaborate, and come back at the end of the class and discuss what they've talked about. So that was, I thought it was an interesting way to run courses, where physically you may not be in the same location. I'm sure it's been done all over the world. But now that just here, I got some ideas. I know people from all around the world working on similar things, but I don't even get them on Skype to talk to our classes. And that immediately can be done. We of course, we have, fast internet, relatively fast internet. That can immediately, we can start. But for this course itself, something like Illuminate, it won't work for the students, because the students are going to be enrolled in an N number of colleges around the country, the way we have to scale up the course part of this project. But what certainly can be done is teacher training, perhaps, through such software, such programs. Right, and that is a component, perhaps introducing them to this way of thinking, the content, getting discussion going from various different parts of the country, and training them to run with the course, or run the course in their own classrooms. Perhaps that is a possibility here. I don't think we can scale up in terms of enrolling students directly, but certainly the teacher training component can be perhaps done this way. There is, because it's also novel, somewhat novel right now, so at least at the moment there is excitement around such things, which I also witnessed. Students were excited about it. Look, we don't have to go, we don't have to walk in the snow all the way to the class. We can simply do this from a coffee shop. So while it is still new, it can be exploited. I don't know how things change, and then there is some lethargy that comes in. So there are some experiences, there are possibilities that we can immediately explore. Actually, we don't have to wait too long deliberating on these things, and start in a series of steps, and somehow try to see how we can supplement our teaching through these technologies. So I'll just stop there and maybe open for questions, discussions, and so on. Buddha and then Suresh.
So, yeah. So I haven't ever thought about this. I was just thinking as the presentations were on. But so when you're talking about technology-enabled solutions, so I was trying to backtrack and think what are the pedagogical challenges that we are trying to solve or address, right? So I think, and so I'm just listing things that come to my mind, and I think if you could add more, it'll help me. So one is, of course, flexibility in choice, flexibility in time and place of learning. The other, so then learning on the metro or things like that, what Mr. Mutakmu was saying. Then how to make teaching more interesting, how to make learning more fun or more interesting. That was another, I think, challenge that was sort of being addressed. And the third one I could identify was how do you address restrictions on intellectual property rights, restrictions of intellectual property rights rather. So am I missing some other pedagogical challenge that we are trying to address is the one question that I have to everybody. The other was in terms of technology also, I think, again, this is very off the cuff, but we need to separate out, I think, three kinds of technological interventions. One is which improves classroom teaching, so things like interactive whiteboards, or the second kind of would be which complements classroom teaching, so for particular e-modules, things like that, and the third would be something like Coursera or entire online courses, so substituting classroom teaching. So all three would, I suppose there are different advantages, disadvantages of three kinds of interventions. So I don't know, this is what I thought on it.
Yeah, I'll just compound the the same thing which actually Buddha has sort of flagged, is that, I mean, just trying to bring more focus to some of this, and that is to sort of gear this towards interdisciplinary challenges. I mean, pedagogy that is associated with interdisciplinary issues. So besides some of the issues that Buddha has already flagged, how do we deal with the sort of, what I'm trying to say therefore is that, have we clearly identified, delineated the pedagogical challenges in interdisciplinarity that we need to tackle first? So I guess, I mean, maybe as an activity in the project, shall we cull that out? So for instance, objective, subjective nature of knowledge, and interdisciplinarity this is one area where you are battling what is objective, what is subjective, and why a particular thing is whichever way. And this constant back and forth, which is a challenge. It's the same problem in an interdisciplinary situation is usually we exhibit that it can be looked at with multiple perspectives. In other words, for the same issue, there could be various explanatory models sort of coming to the same problem. So this is an idea in interdisciplinary sort of classrooms. And so how can we sort of think of, I don't know, I mean, I haven't thought of it either. So how can we think of technology to come to, help resolve this? So it's like, can the orange be peeled in different ways and you can get different products? I don't know. I mean, something like that. Just 1 or 2 points more. Then the even slightly more deeper problems, which is, I'm just imagining master's level at this stage. So I'm sorry to keep it at a particular sort of temperament. Epistemological differences. So for instance, this is not disconnected with the objective subjective nature of knowledge. It's the idea of adequate proof, for instance. So while it's, these are the spots where we get challenged. What is adequate proof by a particular means in sciences is not the kind of adequate proof in, let's say, social sciences or some other. So the reverse is actually more common, that you may display that there is a confused sort of a setup somewhere, and it is what it is. So it does not, basically it challenges the idea of proof in principle. So that's one aspect of it, which, I mean, this is connecting to the previous session also, where we were saying that scientists and their obsession with truth, and they imagine that there is truth, and sociologists and philosophers argue that there is no absolute truth. I mean, it's all a creation of a particular context. So there is no truth. So, pardon? No, I haven't said anything to that effect. All I'm saying is that they exist. So, so the point being that, so this is the kind of space that we are trying to negotiate, just sharply, because there's so much interesting stuff coming from what kind of technologies enabled sort of possibilities exist out there. Can we draw upon some of that to bring us back into the interdisciplinary space where we were in the throes of whatever in the forenoon, the kind of difficulties people were articulating in the forenoon. Yeah.
Actually, if I can just jump in, a lot of the discussion even in the previous session that now you pointed out is pretty much around the whole positivist and post-positivist sort of tensions. That obviously still remains. Although, from the other direction, that is the one that you categorize as sort of philosophy and sociology, there is more and more, I mean, very few people now challenge the notion of truth itself, or hardly any. There is, of course, understanding. There are knowledges. We have to understand. We have to work with facts, even as we work with politics, and we work with different notions or different understandings of the same facts and so on, and their histories of creation and generation. So that's one thing. But but in terms of the challenges, I think one major challenge is that, except for a few of us, most of us are trying to teach interdisciplinarity while ourselves being a product of very disciplinary ways of thinking.
That's right.
So maybe at least in the first generation teaching, you have to, technology may help. Maybe folks who are the product of this new way of thinking, new way of approaching questions, they may stand alone somehow, or they may be able to do it more successfully, or they'll be more naturally attuned to it. Yeah, Shankar.
See, there are a couple of things with both the speakers. One was when you spoke about learner ownership and the fact that there is information overload now. The other thing that you pointed out was a problem of access. Now that is a very digital divide kind of argument. Now the question is, how do we sort of go about it? How do we address it? I mean, the digital divide is now no longer technological, like Amitabh said. I mean, like, everyone has a smartphone, or everyone has access to a smartphone. So therefore, it's not technological anymore. But is the divide now linguistic? access to knowledge, is it based now on the fact that I cannot speak English or, whatever language that knowledge sort of originates in. So, the pedagogical challenge to me really is, how do I make this more accessible? Do I create content which is broader based, in terms of multilinguistic content, so that it is accessible to more and more people? And there is, of course, the old GIGO argument, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Now, that is something that is magnified 1,000-fold when you're looking at powerful dissemination technologies like the internet. So even, there was, for instance, the UGC experience with distance learning, where MCRC, where I studied, and EMRC in Hyderabad were set up to create content which would then go out on television. Of course, that was just simple one-way traffic. There was no question of coming back. And that was actually, I think, the original death by PPT, because they'd just block a camera off and one guy would be standing in front of a blackboard and yakking away.
So, it used to be on television, right?
Yeah, it was on TV. That is, yeah. Also, then when you talk about aggregators, and the fact that aggregators have more resources available to them now than they ever had, I think the challenge there is that the act of aggregation itself has to be a continuing exercise. It can't end at, I can't decide that today's state of knowledge is what I'm going to sort of carry forward. So, that is where I think, those are the questions in my mind, that how do I address the basic issue of access? That to me is the more, and how is technology going to sort of enable the classroom to come in an intelligible form to the student?
Haven't you seen the idea internet? Yeah, exactly. But more seriously, that linguistic thing is something we spend far too much time talking about every day. The challenges in terms of, yeah, absolutely.
What he's saying is the epistemology. Yeah. I thought it's not so much about language per se. I don't know.
Language of the discipline and language per se, both. Yeah.
Language, so I understood this language as disciplinary language, probably. Correct.
Anyway, we have Asmita and then Dennis.
Yeah, so my, to me the challenge, I think Shankar sort of touched upon that in the end, is that with the creation of content, there are things that, technology can help us to scale and do various other things, but anybody who's taught in a good old classroom will know that every year you bring something new to the class. There are those, and I don't know if they happen to students, but they happen to me all the time, the aha moments in class, where somebody asks you a question and you have no idea you know this till they had asked you this, and then the answer just pops out from somewhere. And then you take that into the next lecture, and there are those instant, epiphanic changes that you make in your class and so on. And it would be a shame if, in sort of trying to package online learning materials, we actually miss out on the best part of teaching. So, and I have no idea how that gets, whether it's even reconcilable, this challenge, if you're going to scale out and create content. And I know obviously nobody is going to have resources always, all the time to keep updating every year. But the fact of the matter is that in the classroom, we do update every year, and it's what makes it possible to go on teaching the same course every year, because you don't teach the same course every year. I hope not. That's the day you need to quit, probably. So how does one bring that into content creation and dissemination over a wider thing? To me, that's a very big challenge, because in trying to create better and more interesting material, if we do away with the core of what teaching is to the teacher, which is its learning, that would be a shame.
Just what Shankar was saying about, well, a couple of you mentioned earlier initiatives on the part of the government, Vidya Darshan or whatever. I was just in this meeting on Friday with people from the, whatever it stands for, NMEICT, what, National Mission for Education to blah, blah, blah. They haven't given up on television at all. Because they've they know that the penetration of television is still greater than that even of tablet devices, and probably will be that way for some time. So they're actually talking about having 50 new regional television stations, each delivering 8 hours of content minimum a day. So, 400 hours of original programming that needs to be done every day and so on. And again, this is supposedly going to be more interactive. So instead of it being one way, viewers will be able to, send SMSs or online or whatever, and will actually in real time be able to ask questions of the people who are broadcasting live. So, it's easy to make fun of it, I guess, or kind of imagine what kinds of technological problems will arise, but obviously NMEICT is still putting a lot of, investing a lot of hope in satellite television as a way of educating people. Sorry, that was just a little aside, just based on something that I learned the other day. But I was going to ask something about assessment, assessment or evaluation. As Amitabha pointed out, what's the point in having these eureka moments, epiphanies, and believing as a teacher that that's really what you should be doing, kind of inviting people to experience these epiphanies, if in the end most of the evaluation is going to be based on some kind of standardized knowledge. And again, in this meeting that I just mentioned on Friday, I was surprised at how many people were talking in terms of, they had this particular dichotomy, formative assessment and summative assessment. And the way they talked about it, it was clear that what's considered important is still the summative assessment. In other words, the degree to which every student is getting that same content or learning about it in the same way, or maybe learning about it in different ways, but eventually accumulating the same content. And again, the formative, it's not even really clear what formative assessment is supposed to be according to that definition. So this is just kind of a stray thought, but we're constantly worried about assessment and designing good assessment regimes for them that captures all of these different kinds of teaching and learning experiences, and getting the right balance between, if you want to use those terms, the formative and the summative and so on. And I'd be interested to hear what some of you have to say about how the assessment process itself can be, or is being changed by these new technologies, because it seems to me that we often still fall back on this same very standard notion of learning being measured in terms of some outcome which all learners have, or in other words, you're assessed on the degree to which you got that predetermined outcome or not. So it's just a question about how we deal with that, how we deal with not just interdisciplinarity, but any kind of teaching learning situation in terms of assessment through these technology.
There's some workshop at AUD itself on assessment, because one hears few things sometimes, especially from the psychology. When you're sitting with psychologists, they always talk about some interesting things they're trying out. We don't really know what exactly they're doing and how it's working out. Right?
Yeah, I was just saying that moving forward, because while it's nice to sit and actually deal with the problems of the whole world and scale and all of that, there are some good things happening by way of starting points for us, I think, as part of this project. One is that we are not in a university where the people who teach and the people who design assessments are two separate sets of people. So, for instance, for the level 1 environment course, which is a compulsory course across all undergrad colleges, I was in a workshop 2 weeks ago, and there, while the experts, the people who drive the content, for instance, had these whole list of aspirations about what all a person being exposed to the environment should know. We were also working with the Delhi University question paper on that course, which had scarily brain dead questions on the subject. And of course, I mean, you have folks inside in your own homes that these experts were relating the experiences of, saying, "Hum to 2 दिन पहले पढ़ते हैं, we just studied 2 days before, and we managed to clear the exam. So why the hell would anybody?" Now at AUD, thankfully, and especially for the courses where we are starting with this, there hopefully isn't that problem, in the sense that assessments and teaching are controlled by the same set of and designed by the same set of people. So at least in a boutique university of our kinds, before we are scaled up to meet the aspirations of Delhi and all the rest of it, it is possible to start by way of at least a demonstration of what can be done, and at least that minimum level needs to be the objective of an exercise like this, that can be just create some sort of doable things. Some flags can be put out there about what will be the major challenges in that, and then leave it to others to try and do this in their own context and put up their own flags and derive their own learning. So that's one. So I think while it's a worthwhile exercise to list all the possible challenges of doing this across everything, or across the different landscapes where this will get done, we need to also shortlist and narrow down and then start getting our teeth into the challenges that are there with us. So for instance, the linguistic challenge is there to a relatively limited degree in our setup than it is in DU, for instance, or it would be somewhere else. The assessment challenge is relatively limited. So, we need to then start with something and actually come out with, because this needs to lead to somewhere eventually in a very definable, defined time period.
In the context of the film that we're thinking about, where the language of the interview is in a local sort of patois, which is not going to be understandable across even your equal partners. So how do we deal with, and so this is, so it's in that sense, it's not a problem where somebody doesn't understand English. Now we have a problem where somebody does not understand colloquial Hindi. So, how are we going to deal with, and because this is going to go on and it'll be out there and, to be used by everyone.
Maybe what we can do, just get responses of the two panelists on what the discussion has touched upon so far. Yeah. Please, Amitav, if you'd like to go first.
Well, this is an interesting point. I mean, what Shankar spoke about, and though I think, from what I understand, the assumption here is that if the language of instruction presumably is English, then most, I presume all people do comprehend it at the level required, so that the medium of instruction itself is not an obstacle. Is that a correct understanding? Yeah, because in my experience, and again, I have no academic research to back it up with, to me it's a huge, formidable problem, often denied and completely unaddressed. So, and especially when the content itself becomes complex, then I think it can really get in the way of comprehension. So that's something we need to be careful about, and unfortunately I have only bad news to offer here, because I have also worked in the domain of language learning, and it's really tough. Once again, I think there are a lot of canards out there, and people have this quick fix solution: teach people grammar, teach people vocabulary in silos, and they craft this 48-hour course they claim will actually, in a sense, create competencies which never existed. Complete, total bunkum and myth. Actually learning a language is a huge task, and we all have done it unconsciously. But if you really look at our own competencies, then it's come through hundreds and thousands of hours of speaking, reading, writing, etc. It's been a very immersive, intensive process. And if there are people who do lack that, and if that comes in the way, it requires a completely different form of remediation, and that needs to be addressed in a very fundamental manner. Now, to quickly, so in a sense, that really needs a specific focus. I don't think you could even include it in the scope of what you're talking about currently. Now, there's a quick response, and I don't think I could quite understand your point. If I remember right, you spoke about changes. Now, actually, if you have a technology backbone, quickly changing parts of the content and disseminating it actually becomes easy. And also was somewhat foxed by what you said, or maybe it's a gap in my understanding, that you said that in a sense, if you don't keep changing and if you don't innovate, then obviously it's going to be a dead organism. But I don't understand why scaling via a technology would lead to that. So maybe once you explain it, I could quickly respond to it.
In the case of this particular kind of course, the one that we are planning to offer, there aren't too many parallels elsewhere. Now, so we don't even, and in the kind of the way we teach it, we are imagining it as a blended learning course, but with very significant sort of field immersion, which is locale specific and so on. So we could be teaching something in our classroom which relates to our work, which is here in Delhi, and there is some hands-on component. Now somebody else from Jadavpur, and somebody from Hyderabad, and somebody from Shivnadar, and somebody from wherever else. Now you can only put some pointers out there, and those pointers, I can foresee putting them out there for by working on a project like this for a finite period of time. But after that, somebody else will have to run with this, and this is not what one would do full time. One does 100 other things, and in the classroom you make those changes like that. You just do it. But updating it on, even if that backbone exists, and then putting it out there for whoever else is using it, is not something I can foresee happening routinely.
No, that's a pertinent point, and I think it's got both a positive answer and a negative answer. See, ultimately, it's a bit like saying that without love and affection, can something grow? Now, what you're arguing is that individually putting in love and affection, how do you make it a bit of a systemic process? So, I mean, and perhaps associated with this is a more important point, that what do you standardize, scale, and put up as a common resource, or a bunch of resources, or digital learning experiences, interactive or otherwise, and what is it that you leave for individuals to do? And I think it's an absolutely futile argument to make that, as people did, and it's been, kind of, it's like flogging a dead horse, that in no way can technology compensate for lack of capability in teaching. And in fact, I would, as I said, it demands more stuff from the teacher than less stuff. So, however, when you talk about increments being made to what is already there, I think that's a fairly possible thing in the sense that if you consider, for example, MOOCs, and consider one site which I quite liked, what's the name of that site? Academic Earth. I don't know whether you've gone to this. Academic Earth. So what I liked there, and of course it was complete whimsy on my part, that this gentleman called Michael Sandel, a renowned moral philosopher. There's an entire lecture on the trolley problem, essentially, whom do you decide to kill and when. Quite interesting. So the thing about, however, this thing was, why was it so captivating and why was it so interesting? Unfortunately, it was not because of technology. It was because the man himself was very interesting, and he had a terrific amount of charisma. Now, if, for example, for a moment, and I come back to the statement I began with, that, if you imagine somebody's lecture to be video grabbed, then you have to be very careful. Is it somebody like me who's terribly boring, or is it somebody like him who's, let's say, very interesting? So therein would, a lot of effect, or a lot of, in terms of what it does to the target audience is determined by that. However, in terms of at least once that is in place, let's say, and if you chunk it well, then maybe, I have updated, let's say, the theory of the trolley problem, then releasing, let's say, incrementally another thing is not that much of a problem. So it all depends upon what it is. I mean, if for example, if you argue that, things which are totally overhauled because of changes in, local knowledge, etc., if you're doing a really in-depth study about something which is happening in terms of an environmental struggle somewhere, and, a year later, whatever you did the previous year has to be completely overhauled, and into that you invested a lot of money creating technologically led, whatever, then of course that's a bad judgment call.
I mean, I think it's not whether you need to overhaul, whatever content you've created. It's about Web 2.0 and Web 3, which is, are you sort of, do we sort of approach this pedagogical challenge through a wiki model or through an analytics model? Where you're saying that you can plug a hole where you find that attrition is highest, and that's where, so that's your analytics model, your predictive, whatever it is that you're doing, versus a model where the state of knowledge can be updated by the users based on what has already gone before. So, I mean, technical solutions in that situation, which are also in a sense low investment, so you're not sinking a lot of money or throwing good money after bad.
No, and also I think just to touch on what Asmita said, obviously any such initiative cannot be a one-off thing, and in fact you should be very wary, because in the end, no matter what you do will be an experiment, and there is, unfortunately, all of this is no exact science either, and which is perhaps what you said about what is being taught also, strangely enough. So what you do by way of experiments and seeing whether, I'm trying the flipped classroom model, or, I'm trying a wiki or a blog, and then, there will be challenges. Just because you put a blogging platform doesn't mean that people will start blogging. Why on earth will I start blogging? So you have to look at the other issues, that how do I get people to share knowledge? How do we incentivize it? So a lot of thinking, and technology is only one part that you need to be thinking. And just to kind of pin it down fairly clearly, I think if you do undertake such an initiative, then having a group of people who are constantly, as I said, showering love and affection on it, even after your first release, if you will, that is necessary. You can't just do and forget. I mean, that is doom. Very often the first few initiatives don't work. You learn through a fundamental amount of trial and error. That is to be recognized.
Dr. Murugan, would you like to? If you just switch on the mic.
Whether the technology might be a challenge to pedagogy itself. I think it's possible. It's possible if we use technology very casually. But generally, technology can be used as a complementing the teaching, then as a main mode of teaching. So that should be there. And the assessment part, I'm just thinking that when we are working with the wiki space and other things, we have how frequently or what is the extent in which a particular learner critically reflect on a particular theme on different occasions, whether it is consistently is critically reflecting and then adding the information. So that portfolio will reflect the individual's learning itself. So somewhere the formative assessment need to be given more emphasis in the learning. That's what I